The Mexican-American War began in 1830, despite Mexico having gained its independence some years earlier in 1821 from Spain, following a revolution and armed conflict that lasted over a decade. The country was in complete disarray. When examining the map from that time, we see a much larger Mexico than today, a stretched country, one of the biggest at that time. The newly independent nation was in dire straits after 11 years of war. No plans or guidelines were established by the revolutionaries, leading to internal struggle for control of the government. Mexico suffered from a complete lack of funds to organize a country of around 51.99 million square kilometers. Mexico faced threats from emerging internal rebellions and invasion by Spanish forces from their base in nearby Cuba. This government was characterized by instability and was ill-prepared for international conflict. When war with the Americans broke out only 2 decades later, in 1846, the United States was in an expansion phase and was much bigger than when it became independent. The United States expanded deeper into Native American territories and purchased the vast Louisiana territory from the French. Although the country was expanding, there was an opportunity for more due to Mexico's internal problems. Several regions rebelled and tried to break away. Texas gained its independence from Mexico in 1836. Initially, the United States declined to incorporate it into the Union, largely because Northern political interests were against the addition of a new slave state. The Mexican government was also encouraging border raids and warning that any attempt at annexation would lead to war, as the Mexicans still considered Texas part of their land. Annexation procedures were quickly initiated after the 1844 election of Polk, who campaigned that Texas should be reannexed and that the Oregon Territory should be reoccupied. Polk also had his eyes on California, New Mexico, and the rest of what is today the US Southwest. Looking to expand, Polk offered to purchase those lands, but the offer was rejected, and soon after, he instigated conflict by moving troops into a disputed zone between the Rio Grande and Nueces River that both countries had previously recognized as part of the Mexican state of Coahuila. The tension grew more and more over the disputed lands. Texas was annexed by the United States of December 29, 1845, and became the 28th state. However, the United States inherited the southern and eastern border dispute with Mexico, which refused to recognize Texas's independence for the U.S. offers to purchase the territory. Thus, through this act, the tensions between the two countries escalated into war. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a group of U.S. soldiers in the disputed zone under the command of General Zachary Taylor, killing about a dozen. They then laid siege to an American fort along the Rio Grande. Taylor called in reinforcements and was able to defeat the Mexicans at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Following those battles, Polk told the U.S. Congress that the cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before Mexico passed the boundary of the United States, invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. On May 13, Congress declared war, while no official declaration of war ever came from Mexico. In terms of how the war began, the situation is debatable. We have an ill-prepared Mexico with internal revolts and an emerging power looking to expand more and more. Mexico was weaker, but the US did not want to appear as a bully. Even so, Ulysses S. Grant, who had opposed the war but served as an army lieutenant in Taylor's army, claimed in his personal memoirs that the main goal of the US Army's advance from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande was to provoke outbreak of war without attacking first, to debilitate any political opposition to the war. After Mexican independence, a man named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna emerged as a controversial figure. Initially, he did not support Mexican independence from Spain, but later fought it in its favor. He then backed the monarchy of the Mexican Empire, rebelled against the emperor, and subsequently supported the republic. The country struggled to find its path, and these upheavals led to further trouble and weakness over time. Santana served 12 non-conclusive presidential terms over 22 years. After the US declared war on Mexico in 1846, an internal coalition, including the ousted President Mariano Perez, sought a return to a federal republic with Santa Anna as president. He wrote a letter to Mexico City stating he did not wish to return to the presidency but wanted to come out of exile in Cuba to use his military experience to claim the Texas from Mexico. President Valentin Gomez Farias, driven to desperation, accepted the offer and allowed Santa Anna back. What Farias did not know was that Santa Anna had secretly been negotiated with the US representatives to sell all contested territory to US as a reasonable price, on the condition that he be allowed back into Mexico through the US naval blockades. Once back in Mexico, Santa Anna took command of the army, reneged on his promises, declared himself president, and prepared to fight off the US invasion. The Americans achieved 2 victories at the Battle of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. General Stephen Watts Kearney and his troops advanced into the disputed territory in the New Mexico. They encountered no Mexican forces upon arriving on August 15th, entered Santa Fe, and claimed New Mexico territory for the United States without firing a single shot. Kearney declared himself the military governor of the new territory on August 18th and established a civilian government, creating a temporary legal system now known as the Kearney Code. Kearney set out for California on September 25, 1846. In December 1846, after successfully conquering New Mexico, parts of Kearney's army of the West moved into modern-day northwest Mexico, led by Alexander Doniphan, continuing what ended up being a year-long 5,500-mile campaign. However, in the territory, a rebellion known as the Taos Revolt occurred. There were multiple skirmishes, but the US military quickly subdued the revolt. Meanwhile, the commander of the US Navy's Pacific Squadron, John D. Sloat, received orders to seize San Francisco Bay and blockade California ports. Captain John C. Fremont, leading a U.S. topographical expedition to survey the Great Basin, entered the Sacramento Valley in December 1845. Fremont's party was at Upper Calumet Lake in the Oregon Territory when they learned that the war between Mexico and the U.S. was imminent. The party then returned to California. On Sloat's orders, Fremont brought 160 volunteers to Monterrey. On July 15th, Sloat transferred his command of the Pacific Squadron to Commodore Robert F. Scottron, who was more military aggressive. General Castro and Governor Pio Pico wrote farewells and fled separately to the Mexican state of Sonora. Stockton's army entered Los Angeles, unopposed on August 13th. He then reported to the Secretary of State that California was entirely free from Mexican dominion. Meanwhile, U.S. colonist Stephen W. Kearney marched across New Mexico in the Sonoran Desert, crossing the Colorado River in late November 1846. On December 7th, 100 Lancers under General Andres Pico, the governor's brother, clashed with Kearney's army of about 150 at the Battle of San Pascual. Despite sustaining wounds, Kearney pressed onward until he was compelled to establish a defensive position on a hill. General Pico besieged the hill until a 215-man American relief force arrived. Kearney's contingent then embarked on a 150-mile march to Los Angeles. On January 8th, 1847, the combined Stockton, Kearney army defeated the Mexican force in the 2-hour Battle of Rio San Gabriel. The Treaty of Cahuenga was signed, marking the end of armed resistance in California. Though the conflict persisted elsewhere, the Mexican army defeats at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma caused additional political turmoil in Mexico. Led by Zachary Taylor, 2,300 US troops crossed the Rio Grande and advanced southward. The hard-fought Battle of Monterrey resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Mexican forces under General Pedro de Ampudia repelled Taylor's finest infantry. American soldiers, unaccustomed to urban warfare, marched directly down open streets and were caught off guard by well-concealed Mexican defenders. Despite being repulsed, General Taylor negotiated an 8-week armistice with the American army, permitting their withdrawal in exchange for the surrender of the city. Under pressure from Washington, Taylor violated the armistice and occupied the city of Saltillo on February 22, 1847. Santana personally led a northward march to confront General Taylor with 20,000 men. The 4,600 Americans entrenched themselves at a mountain pass called Buena, Vista. The Mexicans experienced desperations en route north and arrived fatigued with 15,000 men. Despite their numerical superiority, Santana demanded the surrender of the US Army but was rebuffed. Consequently, he launched an attack the following morning. Santana outflanked the US position by sending cavalry and infantry up steep terrain on one side of the pass, while another division attacked frontally along the road to Buena Vista. Although initial reports and some propagandistic accounts credited victory to Mexicans instead of pursuing an immediate attack the next day, Santana retreated upon learning of a rebellion, an upheaval in Mexico City. Some military historians argue that the US Army likely would have been defeated if the Mexicans had pressed their final assault. A critical factor in the United States' success in the war against Mexico was securing its naval presence along Mexico's coasts. The US Navy cleared the way for US troops and supplies, particularly to Mexico's primary port of Veracruz. Even before hostilities erupted in the disputed southern region, the US Navy had established a blockade. The US President did not reinforce Taylor's army for a continued advance. Instead, he dispatched a second army under General Winfield Scott. Scott was transported by sea to the port of Veracruz to initiate an invasion of the Mexican heartland. On March 9, 1847, Scott concluded the first major amphibious landing in US history to prepare for the siege of Veracruz. The city defended itself as best as it could with its own artillery against the prolonged barrage. But due to the numerically superior American forces, the Mexicans capitulated. The objective was clearly the capital. Scott marched westward toward Mexico City with almost 9,000 troops. On April 2, 1847, Santa Anna established a defensive position along the main road, about 15 miles northwest of Veracruz at Cerro Gordo. Santa Anna entrenched with 20,000 troops and artillery aimed at the road, expecting to catch Scott off guard. However, General Scott dispatched 2,600 cavalry troops ahead. They reached the pass on April 12th. The Mexican artillery fired upon them, exposing their positions. The Battle of Cerro Gordo commenced and the Americans prevailed, pressing onward. Despite guerrilla harassment of American troops by remaining forces, General Winfield Scott continued toward Mexico City. The capital was besieged through a series of battles around the right flank of its defenses. After the Americans' victories at the Battle of Conquest, the Battle of the Churubusco, peace negotiations began, but collapsed on September 6, 1847. Following the Battle of Molino del Rey and Chapultepec and the storming of the city gates, the capital fell. Scott assumed the role of military governor of occupied Mexico City. His successes in this campaign made him a national hero in the United States. Desertion was a significant issue for the Mexican army, depleting its forces on the eve of the battle. Most soldiers were peasants loyal to their village and family, but not to the generals who had conscripted them. Often hungry, ill, under-equipped, only partially trained, and poorly compensated, the soldiers were held in contempt by their officers and had little motivation to fight the Americans. With the US advancing far beyond the territorial gains it had initially envisioned by invading central Mexico with its dense population, the question arose whether to annex Mexico itself. However, many opposed this idea due to cultural differences, overextension, and massive instability it would provoke. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo granted the US control of Texas, Alta California, and Nuevo Mexico. These territories were later organized into other states. In return, Mexico received $15 million, approximately $443 million today, which was less than half the amount the US had initially offered Mexico. The areas were sparsely populated, likely expanding the low cost for the US. With Texas, the secession from Mexico, the US gained more than 900,000 squares of miles of land. The Gadsden Purchase was another acquisition for the United States, fixing the correct border between Mexico and USA.